Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got a couple of things to discuss, including a couple of recent signings that have happened over the weekend, some possible buyouts that we could see once some of these teams' arbitration cases have been finished, and some trade rumors involving the Wild, the Leafs, and a possible trade between the Vancouver Canucks and the Calgary Flames. And we'll go to all that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the Internet Hockey Channel. As usual, I'm going to kick off with today's video, starting off with some signings that have happened over the weekend. We don't have too many UFAs signing over the past little while, but we do have a lot of RFAs and some entry-level contracts that have been signed. So we'll go to all of those first. To start with, there were a handful of signings on Saturday, a couple of significant ones as well. So the Detroit Red Wings have signed left defenseman Jared McIsaac to a one-year deal with the AAV of $788,000. That was a solid deal for the Detroit Red Wings. McIsaac seems like one of their better defensive prospects, and he had a new deal, so I think that one-year deal is pretty good. I think in time, McIsaac could definitely be a third-pair defenseman, maybe in a year or two. Probably still needs some time in the AHL next year. And the Detroit Red Wings have a pretty deep defense, so I wouldn't expect him to make the roster next year. But maybe in a year or two time, McIsaac could definitely challenge for a third-pair role. So that's a solid signing there for the Detroit Red Wings. Then the Tampa Bay Lightning's avoided arbitration with Tanner Jeannot, signing him to a 2-year contract extension with an AAV of $2.665 million. That's a solid deal in my opinion. I thought Jeannot would have probably asked for over $3 million, but the Bolts were able to get him for $2.665, which really does help out the cap, and it's going to keep them under the cap for the time being, being able to put Seabrook's contract on long-term injury reserve. So that's a solid deal for the Lightning. In my opinion, that's a pretty good deal. Jeannot will be a UFA at the expiration of the deal, so I think definitely it's really likely that Jeannot could wind up leaving after the 2 years. But I also think it's quite possible that the Bolts try and extend him as early as they can. So it's a solid deal for the Bolts, and hopefully Jeannot sticks around for longer than just the 2 years in the contract. So it's a solid signing there for Tampa. The Seattle Kraken signed one of their first picks in the 2023 NHL entry draft, signing Edward Chalet, who was the 20th overall selection in the first round, to a 3-year ELC with AAV of $950,000. He looks like a really good player. I think he could definitely make the NHL roster in the next maybe 1 or 2, possibly 3 years. He's a guy who's playing in Czechia over the past couple of years, so it's quite possible he goes back to Europe. It's also possible that with him being one of those players in Europe, he could also possibly play in the AHL this year. So he'll probably either play in Europe or the AHL this year, but in a year or two's time, I would not be surprised if he was challenging for a roster spot at the NHL level. So a solid signing there for the Kraken. The Pittsburgh Penguins have signed RFA defenseman Ty Smith to a 1-year league minimum deal. That's a solid deal for the Penguins, given the fact that Smith was basically an AHL forward for the entirety of the season last year. After they got him from the Devils in exchange for John Marino, it's definitely been a really rough season for Smith after having a couple of NHL seasons. Hopefully he can show this year that he's still NHL ready and he gets into some NHL action. So hopefully for Smith he can get into that NHL action. On top of that, the Vegas Golden Knights and Carolina Hurricanes both signed entry-level contracts with some of their first picks in the 2023 draft. The Carolina Hurricanes signed second-round pick Felix Unger-Sorum to a 3-year ELC with the AAV of $860,000, while the Golden Knights signed the 32nd overall pick in the first round, David Edstrom, to a 3-year ELC with AAV of $950,000. So for both these guys, pretty good deals. Probably won't be NHL forwards for the next 2 to 3 years for both of them, but definitely getting them on their ELCs is pretty good. So good for the Knights to get Edstrom, good for the Canes to get Sorum, and hopefully both of these guys in time could definitely be solid NHL players. Now you have 3 signings from the Arizona Coyotes, one from Saturday, one from Sunday, one from Monday. On Saturday, the Arizona Coyotes signed UFA winger Justin Kirkland to a 1-year league minimum deal. On Sunday, the Arizona Coyotes signed goalie Ivan Prosvetov to a 1-year league minimum deal. And on Monday, the Arizona Coyotes signed left winger Matias Maccelli, who was one of the guys who was in the running for the Calder Cup this year, to a 3-year contract with the AAV of $3.425 million. So all 3 signings are pretty good. Prosvetov seems to be what the Arizona Coyotes view as possibly the goalie of the future for them, so that's pretty good for them. They still have Ingram and Vejmelka on the system this year, So I would most likely expect Krasnodar to be the AHL starter, but if they run into injuries, he's definitely going to be one of their first call-ups. As for Kirkland, decent forward, but probably not one to actually make the NHL roster. I would expect him to more of an AHL forward. So a solid sign there, add some depth to their forward group. I wouldn't expect him to be more than an AHL forward. As for Michelli, he's definitely one of the bigger pieces of that team right now. He fits in really well in the top six. Probably going to play mostly on the second line this year. So I think that 3-year, $3.425 million deal is a pretty good deal for Michelli. And I think the Arizona Coyotes will really like that deal. So solid signings there for the Arizona Coyotes. Some other signings that happened on Sunday, July 16th. The Anaheim Ducks signed their goalie of the future, and Lucas Dostal, who will most likely be the backup to Gibson this year, as it looks like right now, to a 2-year, two-way deal with AAV of $813,000. So a solid deal for Dostal. I think he should definitely continue to live up to that. He's definitely had some NHL action over the past couple of years and looks to get into a regular NHL role this year. So that's a solid deal, and I'll expect him to be a backup this year and maybe as early as next year, maybe in a tandem as like a 1A goalie. So I think eventually he will be the starter, but he's going to get some NHL action this year, so definitely a solid signing there for the Ducks. The Minnesota Wild signed one of their arbitration cases, finishing it up before it happens, and that is that they signed Brandon Duhaime to a 1-year, one-way deal with AAV of $1.1 million. So it's a solid deal. Duhaime's definitely really proven over the past couple of years that he's a solid bomb six forward, so I really do like that deal. Hopefully, Duhaime can continue to be a really good physical fourth-line forward who can produce at certain times as well. So it's a solid deal for the Wild. As for the other signing, it was also another one that got rid of an arbitration case, and that is that the St. Louis Blues signed winger Alexei Toropchenko to a 2-year deal with AAV of $1.25 million. Another guy who was supposed to be having an arbitration case in the not too distant future. So it's really good to see him sign with the Blues. He's definitely did well last year in like a bomb six role. So I don't expect that to be too bad of a contract over the next couple of years. He should definitely continue to work his way up. Hopefully maybe by the end of this contract he can be a solid third line forward. But I expect mostly for next year he'll be a fourth line forward and he'll have to work his way up. But he can definitely be a top 9 forward if there are injuries. So definitely a solid deal for the Blues, and I think a solid deal for Toropchenko. So some solid deals there on Sunday, and then on Monday we had a couple more signings. The Chicago Blackhawks finally signed Connor Bedard to his ELC, 3 years, $950,000, all of the signing bonuses and stuff that he can earn. So he got all of the perks of signing his ELC. He ended up signing on his birthday, which was yesterday, so that was really cool to see. But really, I don't think this comes as much surprise. Bedard was going to sign his ELC. I think it was surprising that guys like Carlson and Fantilli and a couple of these other guys had signed their ELCs before Bedard. But just given the fact that they wanted to wait till his birthday, I think that was really a good move by the Blackhawks. And now Vladar is officially signed with Chicago. So I would expect him to probably make the roster out of training camp, and that's a solid signing there for the Chicago Blackhawks. The Florida Panthers signed 2 players to league minimum deals. They signed RFA defenseman John Ludwig to a 2-year league minimum deal, and they signed UFA defenseman Casey Fitzgerald to a 1-year league minimum deal. So Fitzgerald was a part of the team last year, was basically a 7th defenseman after they claimed him off of waivers. And he definitely worked really well with that team, so that's a solid sign there for the Panthers, and he can definitely help out on like the third pair while the team continues to recover from injuries. Ludwig I would expect to be more of an AHL defenseman next year, but he's still a solid signing and continues to have some depth. So some pretty good signings there for the Panthers. The Bruins signed 3 players, 2 defensemen and a goalie. They signed defenseman Alec Regula and Riley Walsh to 1-year league minimum deals, and they also signed goaltender Michael DiPietro to a 1-year league minimum deal. So they got 3 more pieces of their RFA business done. That's really good. Walsh and Regula, I would expect both to be challenging for like bottom pairing roles next year. Maybe not get there because the Bruins do have a pretty deep defense, but I would expect them to at least challenge for third pair roles. As for DiPietro, he's a decent goalie. I expect him to most likely be like the 4th stringer next year, maybe the 5th stringer. Probably still a little bit back on the depth chart with guys like Allmark Swayman and maybe even Boosie as well as ahead of him. So hopefully DiPietro will get some AHL playing time, but that's definitely a solid sign there for the Bruins to get some goaltending depth in DiPietro and some more defensive depths in Walsh and Regula. The Buffalo Sabres signed Linus Weisbach to a 1-year league minimum deal. Once again, not bad of a contract. Most likely, Weisbach will be an AHL forward, so I don't think it'll be too surprising if we don't see him make the NHL roster. On top of that, you've also got 3 pretty big signings. The Winnipeg Jets came in terms with one of their arbitration cases, signing versatile forward Morgan Barron to a 2-year deal with AAV of $1.35 million. Biron's definitely been more of a bomb six forward these past couple of years, and I'll expect him to continue to be a bomb six forward, but he's definitely been a solid addition, and I'll expect him to continue to be like a solid bomb six forward over the next couple of years. The New York Islanders finally got a deal with Oliver Wahlstrom, signing him to an $874,000 AAV deal for 1 season. So Wahlstrom definitely seems like really a big season for him. He really needs to have a good breakout season this year to prove that he can still be a solid NHL goal scorer. He definitely started to look like that this past year, but then got injured, so hopefully he can continue to do really well. And on top of that, the Colorado Avalanche signed Ross Colton, who was another one of their arbitration cases, and finally got him done on a 4-year contract extension with an AAV of $4 million. So definitely really good for Colton. Colton was a year away from being a UFA, so this contract buys out 3 UFA years plus 1 RFA year. And I definitely think that this is a solid signing for the Avalanche. So pretty good signing for Colorado to sign Colton, Biron to go to Winnipeg, and then all those other signings are all pretty good as well. So some pretty good signings there all throughout the last 3 days. We've gotten some of the arbitration cases now finished. We've also got some of the RFA business for some of these teams done. Some of these teams have signed UFAs. And we've also got a couple of ELCs like Bedard and Edstrom and Sorum. So definitely interesting to see how many more signings we get over the next couple of days. But it definitely seems like it's slowed down at least a little bit. And we're starting to get at least a little bit less signings over the past little while. So that's pretty interesting, but for the time being, that's all the signings we're going to get to here today. Going to talk about some possible buyouts that have happened. So, as we saw last week, I talked about this on my video last Saturday, the Philadelphia Flyers bought out Tony DeAngelo after the arbitration cases were done. So, that was really interesting to see, and apparently, after all the arbitration business is done, 3 days or 72 hours after that last signing happens, they will get a 48-hour buyout window with a chance to buy out some players. Now, there's, like we said, a lot of teams out there who are really tight against the cap and could use some cap flexibility. So, could we see some more teams possibly wind up buying out players? Now, as we talked about, they have to be having all of the arbitration cases done. So, as we just talked about, Duhaime in Minnesota signed his 1-year deal, and Winnipeg signed Biron to a 2-year deal. Those 2 players were guys who are on arbitration for the Jets and the Wild, but the Jets still have an arbitration date with Gabe Vilardi, and the Wild still have an arbitration date with Philip Gustafsson. So, for the time being, those 2 teams still have an arbitration date, so they don't get a buyout window yet. But there are a couple of teams who have already had their buyout window enacted. Now, 3 teams who did sign players over the weekend will get a buyout window in the not-too-distant future. The Tampa Bay Lightning, who signed Tanner Jeannot on Saturday, will get a buyout window, most likely at some point today. I'm not exactly sure what sort of time, but the Bolts will get an opportunity to buy out players later today. I don't expect them to do much on the buyout window thing, just given the fact that the players who they could possibly buy out during this window have to be over a $4 million cap hit. And the only players that are over a $4 million cap hit for the Tampa Bay Lightning are the core players like Chernak and Stamkos and Kucherov and Point and Cirelli and Hedman and Sergachev and Vasilevsky. And I don't see him buying out any one of those guys. So I would not expect the Bolts to buy out anyone. And then you have the Avalanche, who signed Ross Colton to his new deal that will give the Avalanche a buyout window on Thursday. But I don't expect the Avalanche to make any buyouts. The only guys who are available for buyouts are guys like Lehkonen, Nichushkin, Rantanen, McKinnon, Girard, Manson, Taves, Makar, and all those guys are key pieces of that team that I don't think that they will want to buy out. So I don't expect the Avalanche to buy out anyone either. The team that's going to be interesting who has finished their arbitration cases will be St. Louis. The Blues, I'm not exactly sure when they sent Toropchenko. I saw some reports saying that it was late Saturday night or early Sunday morning, so they'll most likely get a buyout window either later today or early on Wednesday morning. And when they do, they should be able to buy out maybe one of these guys. I do think there's a couple of options out there for St. Louis who could possibly be bought out. I think there's a very likely chance that one of their defensemen, either Torrey Krug or Nick Leddy, will end up getting bought out. Both guys have a couple of years left. I think Krug has 3 or 4 years left at a $6.5 million cap hit. Leddy has 3 years left at a $4 million cap hit. So they're not going to be overly easy to buy out. But we know the Blues wanted some change on the blue line. Maybe this is the way they do it, by buying out someone. I also think there's a possibility that Brendan Savage is most likely a bomb six forward in St. Louis now. I think there's a possibility he gets bought out as well. He makes a $4.5 million cap hit for the next 2 or 3 years. And that could be another guy who I think gets bought out. So the Blues are going to be a team to watch over the next 24 hours, as there's going to be a possibility that they try and either maybe move one of these guys, or maybe they buy out someone. It's going to be interesting to see, but I definitely do think that there's a very likely chance that the Blues either buy out one of Leddy or Krug, or maybe even Saad. So it's going to be interesting to see, and I think the Blues are going to be a team to watch over the next little while to see if they possibly buy someone out. But for players who have not yet signed their deals, who have not yet had their possible buyout windows, you have the Chicago Blackhawks with Philip Kurashev. He has not signed yet. He has a hearing on July 20th, so we're going to have to see if he still gets signed. For the Hawks, wouldn't expect too much, just given the fact that they're one of the bottom-dwelling teams, and they probably need all of their contracts. The two guys who I would think are the most likely to be bought out would be Tyler Johnson, who has 1 year left at $5 million, or Nikita Zaitsev, who has 1 year left at $4.5 million. But once again, with the Hawks being so close to cap floor, I would expect both those guys to most likely stay on the team. So once again, the Hawks probably won't buy out anyone, but if they were to, I think Tyler Johnson or Nikita Zaitsev would be a likely option. The Bruins still have two players scheduled for arbitration hearings, and that is Trent Frederick and Jeremy Swayman. Frederick on August 1st and Swayman on July 30th. And I think it's very likely that both of those guys, once they get signed, will once again open up a buyout window for the Bruins. But once again, I don't expect the Bruins to do too much. The only players they have available of possibly being bought out are guys like Coyle and Zaka and DeBrusk and Marchand and Pasternak, the defenseman Lindholm, McAvoy, Carlo, and Ullmark. And I don't expect the Bruins wanting to buy out any of those guys. So I don't expect the Bruins to buy out anyone. The Arizona Coyotes still have Jack McBain scheduled for a hearing on July 30th. I don't expect him signing to be a trigger of the Arizona Coyotes buying out anyone. The only players they have a possibility of buying out would be newly signed Zucker and then Schmaltz, Krause, and Keller. And I don't expect the Arizona Coyotes to buy out any of those guys. So I don't expect those guys to be bought out. The Ducks still have a hearing with Troy Terry for August 2nd. Now, they're an interesting team. They're once again a team who's right now below the cap floor, but they still have to sign Troy Terry, Trevor Zegras, Jamie Drysdale, which will definitely close the gap to get them over the cap floor. But if they were to buy out possibly one guy, I could see him possibly buy out one of Jakob Silfverberg or Am Henrique. Both those guys are on 1 year deals. They make over $5 million. They could be a guy who I could see the Ducks wanting to buy out. So once again, I don't think it's definitely guaranteed given the fact that the Ducks are not over the cap floor yet. But I do think if they were to consider buyout, I think Henrique or Silfverberg is a likely possibility. If you look at the Winnipeg Jets, there's definitely a couple of options. I think the most likely option there for a buyout would be defenseman Nate Schmidt. He makes a $5.95 million cap hit for the next, I think, 2 years. And he hasn't really worked out for the Jets. And there's been a lot of talk that he could be moved by the Jets as well. So if they can't move him by the time that Gabe Vilardi's arbitration is done, then I definitely think that there's a quite likely chance that maybe the Jets buy out Nate Schmidt. I don't expect anyone in the forward group to, but I could see Nate Schmidt possibly be bought out by the Winnipeg Jets. As for the Seattle Kraken, no one I expect them to buy out. They have some pretty good players on their team making over $4 million. The only guy who I would possibly consider is Alex Wennberg, given their depth at center and given the fact I think he will most likely be the fourth line center this year. But I do think that the Seattle Kraken really do like Wennberg, so I wouldn't be surprised if the Kraken kept Wennberg as their own player. On top of those guys, the Edmonton Oilers have a hearing with Ryan McLeod. Once that's done, they're open a buyout window. They don't have too many players making over $4 million, and all the ones are key pieces of that team. The one guy I would consider would possibly be Jack Campbell if they really don't feel that he can bounce back this upcoming season. But that would be a really hefty buyout, and I think it will only be a last case scenario. So I would definitely think that it's very likely that Campbell remains with the Oilers. For the Penguins, they're going to be an interesting team. They have a scheduled hearing with Joe O'Connor on August 4th. Once that's done, they'll have a buyout window opened. There's been a lot of talk with them buying out one of Granlund or Petrie once that buyout window opens. So once they get the contract done with Joe O'Connor, I think that they're going to be a really interesting team to watch. The Rangers have a player, Brendan Scallon, who has a hearing on August 4th. After they get the Scallon contract done, they'll go to buyout window. I don't expect them to buy out anyone. All their players who are making over $4 million are key players on that team. Plus, I think the only really buyout candidate that they had was Barclay Goodrow, and Goodrow makes less than $4 million. So I wouldn't expect the Rangers to buy out anyone. As for the Wild, as soon as Phil Gustafsson signs, they'll get a buyout window as well. And for the Wild, I don't expect too many players to be of interest of buying out. They only have guys like Spurgeon, Brodin, Zuccarello, Kaprizov, Ek, and those are all guys who are key pieces of that team. So once again, don't expect the Wild to buy out anyone. Don't expect the Rangers to possibly buy out anyone. I wouldn't expect Seattle to most likely buy out anyone. But there are a couple of teams there, like maybe the Jets or the Ducks or the Penguins or the Hawks. Or there's definitely going to be a couple of teams here who have the possibility of buyouts who I think could use that as well. So it's going to be interesting to see. And one team I forgot to mention was Toronto. They have a scheduled hearing with Ilya Samsonov. Once that's done, they could open the potential buyout for Matt Murray. We talked about that for a while, as the Leafs would want to get rid of the Matt Murray contract. So that's going to be interesting to see. That's another really likely buyout that happens. So going to be interesting to see, but there's definitely a handful of teams out there who, once they finish up the arbitration cases and all their arbitration business is done, that they will likely, possibly have a buyout window open. And once the buyout window opens, there's a very likely chance that some of these guys get bought out. So going to be interesting to see, but that's something I wanted to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks as we start to finish up some of these arbitration cases. But that's all I want to talk about here with the possible buyouts. Now let's go over to some of these trade rumors that I'm going to talk about here today. First with the Minnesota Wild. Could the Minnesota Wild wind up getting a top-line center before the season starts? Now, it'd definitely be a difficult challenge for them to do, but they do still have $7.1 million in cap space, but they do still have to sign guys like Kalen Addison and Philip Gustafson, who are high-valued RFAs. So if they can get Gustafson signed for between $2.5 and $3 million, and Addison signed for between $1.5 and $2 million, I think they would have enough cap space to possibly go after a center that would have about $2 to $3 million left in cap space if they sign those two contracts. And I think there's a possibility that they could still go after a center. Now, the top centers possibly still available would be Elias Lindholm, if he doesn't sign a contract extension with Calgary, and Mark Scheifele in Winnipeg. Both those top-line centers are possibly going to be on the move, maybe even before the season starts. For both of those guys, they're key pieces of their team. They would definitely need some really good return assets. But the Wild actually have some pretty decent pieces that they could move. They have a couple of draft picks. They haven't moved too much out of their system, so they still have some decent draft capital. The team also has a lot of high-end talent, especially on the defensive end, with guys like Carson Lambos, Ryan O'Rourke, Damon Hunt, so they can move maybe one of those young defensemen. They could also move a forward prospect. They also have a lot of forward prospects as well, so they have a deep prospect pool, maybe one of the deeper ones in the league, so they could definitely be a really interesting team, a team who entices Calgary or Winnipeg with a decent package to maybe add one of those guys. Now, once again, I think Lindholm makes over $4.5 million and Scheifele makes over $6 million, so they would have to retain most likely around 50% of that contract to make it work. But if they were to retain half of that contract, whether it be Calgary or Winnipeg, to bump out down the cap hit, and if the Minnesota Wild maybe move on from Marcus Foligno, who's entering the final year of his deal, a $3.1 million cap hit, that would be enough, I think, to bring in one of those two guys. So if they were to maybe make a package of like a first-round pick, Marcus Foligno, and maybe one or two prospects to Calgary or Winnipeg for Lindholm or Scheifele, that I think might be able to get them a top-line center. And I think a top-line center is really important to the Wild, given the fact that the top two centers right now are Eriksson Ek, who is most likely a second-line center, and Ryan Hartman, who's more of a winger, who can play center and has played center over the past couple of years, but is most likely a winger. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think it's maybe a little bit less likely that they do go after a center before the season starts. But if they are able to make the cap work and maybe make some sort of a trade package involving maybe like a Foligno, a first-round pick, and a couple prospects, I think there's at least a small chance that the Minnesota Wild could try and add a center and someone like Elias Lindholm or Mark Scheifele before the season starts. Definitely going to be interesting to see, but I think there's a small chance that the Wild do add a center before the season starts. Next, going over to Toronto Maple Leafs. Might they have to make more than one move to get on their salary cap? Now, at this current point in time, they are $8.8 million over the salary cap, which is really a lot of money. So they're going to have to try and clear some cap space. Now, the big thing for them is they do have the Jake Muzzin contract, which is $5.1 million from this year, that they can move on to long-term injury reserve, because there's a lot of speculation that Muzzin will not be playing this upcoming season. So if Muzzin doesn't play, that gives them $5.1 million they can put on LTIR, which would give them the enough cap space to go down to only being $3.7 million under the cap. So at that point, they either trade or buy out Matt Murray. That will save them, depending on if they trade or buy out him, between $3 million and $4.6 million, which should get them really close to being cap compliant at that point. But the one thing that hasn't been counted in yet is that Ilya Samsonov's going to need a new deal. Samsonov will most likely be getting like a 1 to 2 year deal between $3.5 and $5 million. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. But if they sign Samsonov to $3.5, $5 million, that's going to put them back up about $4 or $5 million above the salary cap. So once again, that gives the Leafs being over the cap. So they're going to have to try and find another way to clear cap space. So I think Murray is definitely going to be bought out or traded, but I don't think it's going to be enough to get them cap compliant for the season. So I think there's a very likely chance that they maybe move a guy like TJ Brody. Brody has a 1 year contract left with $5 million, and depending on what Samsonov signs for and what happens with Murray, I think that moving out that contract would make them cap compliant. So it'll definitely be interesting to see, but I think there's a very likely chance right now that even though they want to move on from that Murray, I think they will. It won't be enough to get them cap compliant, and they may have to move out a guy like TJ Brody at some point this offseason or right before the season starts to free up enough cap space. And they might have to move him to a guy like Anaheim or Arizona who have the cap space to take him on and who have some weaker blue line. And I think if they were to move him there, I think that would have to be the most likely scenarios. I think Brody would be really the only player they could move that would free up enough cap space. It's not too significant to the team. So it's going to be interesting to see. But the Leafs are $8.8 million over the cap right now. They still need to sign Samsonov, and they can't place the Muzzin contract on long-term injury reserve. They will most likely move on from Murray one way or another, but that might not be enough to free up enough cap space. And if they sign Samsonov, they're going to have to most likely move maybe a guy like TJ Brody to free up enough cap space. So don't expect Murray to be the only guy out for the Toronto Maple Leafs, as they will most likely need to move at least one, if not two, more contracts after Murray to become cap compliant. And lastly here, could the Calgary Flames and Vancouver Canucks be a possible trade option? Now it's going to be interesting to see if this winds up going, but this is just something I had thought about over the past little while. Could the Calgary Flames and Canucks make a deal involving Connor Garland and Dan Vladar? Now, we know the Flames do not have an overly deep forward group. They could definitely use some forward upgrades. We know they needed some last year. They really haven't made much changes this year. In my opinion, that forward group has gotten worse, not better, in the offseason. They moved Toffoli for Sharangovich, which is a decent trade, but I don't think at this point in time Sharangovich can put up the production Toffoli put up last year. Plus, they lost some of their depths in guys like Lucic and Ritchie and Lewis, and they haven't really replaced it. So I could definitely see him look for another top 9 winger before the season starts. Could Garland be a fit there? They have enough cap space, in my opinion, to possibly make something like that work, and they have a need in the top 9. So could they possibly go for Garland? I think it's very likely. What would the Canucks get, though, in that sort of a deal? And I think they could possibly look at goaltender Dan Vladar. Now, we know that Vladar is still a guy who the Calgary Flames could look to be trading. The Flames have Wolf, they have Markstrom, they have some pretty good goalie tandem there, so I don't expect either of those two guys to be traded, and it seems like Vladar is the odd man out, so I definitely think that he would possibly be moved somewhere. But with the goalie market not being overly heating up right now, with the only teams who really need a goalie right now being Jersey and Buffalo, I think there's a chance that Vladar is going to be very difficult to be moved. So could the Flames move into Vancouver? Now, Vancouver, they have a solid starting goaltender in Thatcher Demko, and Demko can probably play a really good role with the Canucks as their starter. But as we saw last year, once he was injured, they didn't really have much in the way of solid goaltending, and they still don't. At this point in time, they have a guy like Spencer Martin, who didn't do overly well last year as their backup, or young goalie Arthur Silvovs, who I think still needs to develop in the AHL for the next couple of years. So could they wind up getting Vladar? If they get Vladar for Garland, not only do they clear cap spaces, Vladar I think makes $2.3 million and Garland makes $4.9 million, so they'd be clearing about $2.6 million off their cap. But on top of that, they get a really solid 1B goalie in Vladar, who can definitely give Demko some nights off every now and then, and be a solid goaltender should Demko go down with injury again. So I think that would be a possible trade. I would not say it's 1 for 1. I would definitely think there would maybe have to be a draft pick involved on one side. But could the basis of a possible package be Garland goes to Calgary, helps their top 9, and is a really good player over the next couple of years, and really helps improve that forward group? Well, Vladar goes to Vancouver and is a really solid 1B goalie behind Demko. I think that would be a possible trade for those two teams. It will get rid of the goalie problem in Calgary and would improve the forward group, and it would relieve one of the Canucks of their wingers, which we know they really need to move on from a couple of their wingers, free up cap space, and will get them a solid backup goaltender for Demko in Dan Vladar. So I would definitely think that's a possible trade and something we could watch out for over the next little while, but that's definitely just something I'm putting out there. No rumors or anything speculating that Garland will go to Calgary or Vladar is going to Vancouver, but that's just something I'm putting out there. But that's all I'm going to talk about for today, and I'd definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Which team do you think is most likely to use the buyout window? I would definitely say maybe the Toronto Maple Leafs are the most likely, but I'd definitely love to hear what you think down in the comments on which players do you think could get bought out if there's the buyout window opening for their teams. Do you think the Minnesota Wild get a forward? I think it's very unlikely, but I do think there's a possibility they could get a Lindholm or a Scheifele before the season starts. So definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments if you think that they could get a center before the season starts. Could the Leafs have to move more than just Matt Murray? I think it's very likely given the cap situation right now. And if they do, who do you think they'll have to move on top of Matt Murray? Definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. And on top of those two things, could we see a Canucks and Flames trade? Do you think it will make sense for Garland to go to Calgary and Vladar to go to Vancouver and have that be some sort of a trade package between two of the Western Canadian teams in Vancouver and Calgary? Definitely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. But that's what we're going to talk about for today. Remember to like this video, and if you really liked it, remember to subscribe down below. We've reached 100 subscribers, so thank you all for all of your support. I really do appreciate it. Now let's continue to keep on subscribing, and let's hit the 200 mark next. On top of that, I also do a blog talking about news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So definitely check that out. I'll leave links down in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.